My pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Stephen Barnes. Stephen is the co-deputy lead of the Collaborative Research Team for the Study of Psychosocial Issues in Bipolar Disorder Network. And I think he'll probably break that down a little bit for us, but that's crest.bd. I went and looked at that website, and it's really worth looking at. It's a remarkable project. He's also a faculty member in UBC's Department of Psychology, and he's here to tell us his own personal lived experience with bipolar disorder and to talk about especially the self-stigma that he and I'm sure many of you and people you know have experienced. So please welcome Dr. Stephen Barnes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. The first step in battling self-stigma is, of course, psychoeducation and learning about mental illness in general. So why is there a dog up on a slide, and what does that have to do with self-stigma? Well, when I was asked to give a talk about self-stigma, I immediately, lots of stories came to mind, and then I heard that Victoria was talking before me. And there was no way I was going to trump her in terms of storytelling. So I looked at my bookshelf, and I looked at a set of books on my bookshelf, and that set of books were my sketchbooks. And fine arts has always been a part of my life since basically elementary school. And this drawing is actually one that I was very proud of, that I did towards the end of my high school, my time in high school. Whoop. Okay, there we go. Now these pictures, stepping forward a few years, were actually drawings that I did just after I was diagnosed with depression. And these are my roommates in my second year of university. And the reason I'm showing you these, and the reason I'm showing you all the images that I will show you, is that self-stigma has a big effect on many aspects of your functioning. It can affect it lowers your self-respect. It produces something known as the why try effect, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. Why bother trying? I have a mental illness. It affects how you think about yourself and your own abilities. So there's a common misbelief that all people with mental illness are intellectually disabled. This was told to me when I was young, and it became part of what I thought about myself once I was diagnosed with a mental illness. I thought I was intellectually impaired. I also thought I was creatively impaired. And when I did these drawings, I thought they were terrible. And that was maybe through the lens of a depression. They don't look so terrible to me anymore. But what they do illustrate is the fact that two things. I no longer had any self-confidence because of stigma. That was stigma that I had internalized. And they also illustrate how I saw other people seeing me. And in this case, neither of them were looking at me. And that's very important because I had disclosed to them that I had a mental illness. In fact, it was impossible not to. I was sleeping all the time, and it was actually the woman on the right who actually recommended that I actually go see a doctor for my condition. So I actually also believed that others felt much different about me now that I had a mental illness than they did before. And that stayed with me for quite some time. Those two things, the feeling that I was no longer able to draw or do things that were intellectually challenging, and the feeling that others now saw me as being worth less somehow. I didn't draw a single thing after those drawings, so my sketchbooks jump 7 years. And this is a drawing that I did shortly after I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1. I was in a mixed state. I'm actually quite proud of this now. I wasn't proud of it at the time. It was more a means of self-expression. And that's a third reason why I'm showing you drawings, is that for me, my battle with self-stigma has in part been a battle that I've fought with a pen and paintbrush in many ways. Okay? Now, stepping forward a little bit, I eventually started to disclose my mental illness to other individuals. And this I actually learned quite early on was actually quite helpful for me from a self-stigma standpoint, regardless of their reaction. The fact that I could actually speak about it helped. And with the encouragement of some people who actually work in a studio just down the street from here, Gallery Gachet on Cordova Street, I became involved with this gallery, which basically has a lot of people involved in that gallery who have lived experience with mental health issues or trauma. So I was with individuals who had shared experiences like mine, and they encouraged me to explore my feelings of self-stigma. And one of those feelings that I often had was of people looking at me differently, people staring at me, maybe because of the side effects of the medications that I felt were actually visible to others. I actually, for a long time, felt that I had bipolar written on my forehead in many ways. And so when I would get on the bus and people would look at me, I would think that they would be looking at me as someone with bipolar disorder. And that's what this drawing is about. Okay? The other thing that I explored through my drawings, through their encouragement, and I would like to especially mention the encouragement of William Pope, an artist from Gallery Gachet, was how I felt that other people were somehow two-faced with me in many regards. That is, I would tell them that I had a diagnosis, and then they would act differently around me. They would smile in my face, but then I had this perception that they were talking about me behind my back. Okay? And that's what these drawings are about. What's interesting about these drawings is that when I showed them to people who knew about my diagnosis of bipolar disorder, they actually thought they were self-portraits, which illustrates one of the misconceptions or stereotypes of bipolar disorder, that there's some sort of dual personality there of some kind. But this is a self-portrait, okay? And this I did 2 months ago, okay? And it is basically my realization that the way that I see others seeing me is largely due to the ebbs and flows of my own emotions and my own emotional states and my self-stigma, the self-stigma that I live with. So the stigma that I feel from others in many cases is not from them, it's my own self-stigma being projected onto them, okay? So for me, disclosure has been a major means by which I've dealt with self-stigma. I've disclosed it through my artworks. I've disclosed it by speaking to people. And for example, I spoke to people at Gallery Gachet. I started a peer-led support group at UBC with a bunch of people called the Kaleidoscope. They have a booth out front. If you're interested, you could speak to them after. And in that group, we explored all of our personal experiences with mental health issues. So again, self-disclosure in a safe setting with other people who had lived experience with mental illness was very important for me, okay? I went from that to talking about it freely in my classes. So I teach psychology at UBC. It eventually dawned on me that it made no sense for me to be talking about psychiatric disorders in a classroom without disclosing the fact that I had one, because it painted a very different picture, and it opened my students' eyes a lot more to the realities. I would strategically not tell them until the very end of the year. Okay, so they would not know anything about my mental illness until the very end. And I thought that that was a very powerful way of actually dispelling myths related to certain forms of mental illness, and in particular bipolar disorder. So I moved from safe disclosure to broadcasting one's experience. All along, I didn't know that this was actually a very effective means of dealing with self-stigma. And there's actually research now that's growing that says that this is the case. This is actually taken from a research paper that I found that basically says that self-disclosure can be very helpful for certain individuals with mental illness. That being said, I don't want anyone in here to get the idea that self-disclosure of the nature that I'm doing right now is for everyone, okay? There is a cost associated with self-disclosure, okay? I'm going to come back to that. Can we play the video?
Although I initially did quite well at university, during the second year of my undergraduate degree, things began to change. I felt tired all the time and slept excessively. I was delusional. I thought all my peers and instructors disliked me and saw me as stupid. Most disturbingly, I was also often thinking about ways of killing myself. I felt hopeless and alone. My world had become washed out and frightening.
This is an excerpt from an animation that I hand drew that I am putting into a textbook that I'm working on. This is, for me, the penultimate point of self-disclosure. I am telling now the world my story. And I would like to end on that note. I know I've gone a few minutes over time, and I apologize. And as I mentioned, I do want to underscore the fact that self-disclosure is not necessarily for everybody, that there is a cost-benefit to self-disclosure, and that if you're considering self-disclosure, you need to consider the costs and the benefits associated with it. And that there are also other methods of dealing with self-stigma, like educating oneself and others about mental illness. And there are also other methods as well, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, to help you with self-stigma. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. It makes me think when I hear you talk about this statement that we make to each other every day when we see someone, how are you? We say, how are you? And I'm a talker, so my dad used to say to me, when people say, how are you, Maria, it's a greeting, not a question. But it is a question. And what you've just pointed out is how complex that answer could be and might be. But that it takes skill and it takes knowledge. And just so people know, you are working to educate kids in high school as well, to start earlier and earlier about understanding your own inner world and other people's inner world. Just think if we keep going younger and younger, then maybe that question, how are you, the answer can be more honest and there can be a more open dialogue. So thank you for the work that you do. And you're incredibly talented.